I was really curious about Mary when I first saw her and heard her read, because it's like, where's she from? Like, what is that? What's the sound of her voice and the things she's reading about? Is she country or what? I didn't know what is that. So it just made me lean in. Um, and she was just always like a really loving and fun presence. That was, when you were around her, you would just end up laughing, and she had this wonderful cackly laugh that was just infectious. So yeah. Oh, the first things I heard her read were actually prose, and I think she may have been writing about her biological father. I think that may have been part of the reason it sounded country, because he was a country guy originally before he came up to Alaska. Um, some of my favorite poems of hers are her poem "A Song for My Mother," where she talks about being with her mother in the snow here, and the way her mother tended to cutting salmon, and the sacredness of those acts. But I just love the lines where she says, "So I went the alien ways," because she'd been adopted out. "So I went the alien ways, but I kept my life with you apart." Like, and how it was her strength all the way through. There's so many beautiful ones, but that one always really, it gathers so much of her story into one place. And then her poem, "Prayer Wheel for William," for her brother, it just talks of, she's imagining him, she's away, and she's imagining him as a young boy, a teenager, working the fish wheels, and prayer wheel for William is like the fish wheel turning, it ends saying, "My prayers for you are turning, turning," because she was adopted out, and he stayed here, and he died of TB when he was not yet 20. So yeah, that's the need for prayer. Yeah. There were different phases of Mary's life that I was just got to enjoy being around her. And what's coming to my mind first about what she was like was just her being like, she was in her last years, and she, went in and out of a bit of fuzzy thinking or whatever, but just her delight in all the small things in life. Like, we drove out from where she was staying in Petaluma in California out to the coast one day, and we get to the ocean, and she looks up and she goes, "Oh, look at that bird." And it was like the most ordinary gull in the world that you'd see a million of, but that's what she was like, that she just relished like every little thing, and just was always, she just could feel for everyone's suffering that they'd been through, because she had been through so much, and she'd lost so much so young, that it just made her really wise in so many ways, that she could just see into people and see their suffering and everything that she was working through. It was a long road for her to pull herself out of what trauma does, that makes you do self-harming things. It took her a long time to pull herself out of it, so she could be of so much help to somebody else that was going through something, and know that you're of value, and you have a voice, you have a story. Please come tell us. She just would draw that out of people. And I remember one time sitting with her, like, she and I both went in and out of struggling with tobacco over time, and I haven't done that for many years, but I was sitting across from her at a restaurant back in the days when you could smoke in a restaurant, and I lit up a cigarette at the end, and I had my hand on the table, and she just patted my hand and said, "I hope you don't hurt yourself with those." And it was like, that is the most perfect thing to say to an addict ever, that is so not judgmental, but it's also because she'd been through all those things, and she knew the compulsion that leads you to do things that hurt you. So yeah, I certainly knew along the way the healing power, because Mary was healing her own trauma, and that was in her writing. And so much has changed since she passed, that she couldn't say a lot of things. I don't even think she could think things all the way through to herself, because it was hard to do that without, now there's community to do that with. Yeah. Um, like she couldn't speak, there was no Me Too movement and all that. Like she couldn't speak these things straight out, it was kind of oblique the way she talked about things a lot of the time. So what's changed in the world, like would have been a tremendous relief for her if she had lived through a time when everybody was talking more openly. Not everybody, but more people talking more openly about these things. I've certainly felt, on a personal level, part of how I connected with her was just the sense of, going off track and being wild, as a girl. Like I went through some similar things, like certainly not as intense as being adopted out and, kind of held captive by the person who's abusing you is also your caregiver. Like that's pretty extreme. But just the notion that girls who act wild, you don't have to wonder why, it's like, it's clear why. There's a reason, something happened. Girls don't just act wild. So I'm not even sure she knew that about herself, but I think we can all share that now about how universal this is for women. Like there's no woman that escapes being harmed because of their gender, is the perception I have and what I've experienced being a therapist, that every woman has a story. And I think Mary lived through a time when she could have had a little more support. She could have been a little more comfortable in her own skin, but darn, she did an incredible job of offering all of us something to feel like we can have the courage to turn towards what really happened. And it seems like there's something else in there about the impact of trauma and the healing. I was in 2 different women's writing workshops with her, and one she initiated. Well, she initiated both of them. She co-founded the second one that was in the Tenderloin district. It's a rough neighborhood that she lived in because she didn't have means. She was always kind of poor because of the illnesses she went through and drinking and all the things that she pulled herself out of as best she could. But that workshop, it was all these women bringing their stories together, and we were doing it but we were like pre-Me Too, right? We were all doing that, and it was a lot of women who'd been through all kinds of stuff, like having their kids taken away because they were an addict, or a couple women that had been strippers, and everybody had a story. And there was a woman who was with us the whole time, who was doing her graduate work at UC Berkeley, who ended up doing her dissertation about our little women's community as a form of education. She was studying education. So she wrote a book that was published that's called "Until We Are Strong Together." And that's a quote from a Marge Piercy poem. And that was this form of education we were doing by holding each other's stories. So I think Mary, all that got infused into the work she did, that just understanding of we're all holding each other's stories. So I think what's in her writing comes out. It's an invitation to other people to have courage and know they're not alone, and to know that we don't sit off in a corner and get strong. We get strong together. Yeah, as her literary executor, I never quite imagined all of the power that this could have gathered in the way that Anne Hanley has told Mary's story with her poetry and other writing. I never quite envisioned it that way, and once it's all put together and seeing that the power that it has to help other people recognize themselves and see that she's not hiding this, and she's working it through. So that healing power, and any way that people feel, uh, men and women, not just women, but feel like they're not alone, is, and any way that any of the children here in these communities would see her, as somebody who, oh, she's this person of note that came from here. Oh, and this is what she did. And it's about us, and it's about healing, and it's about all the stuff we all go through. That it would be, comforting and an inspiration to, especially to kids, to see their own culture in this other light, sort of looking from the outside in. Mary could do both, right? And then in any way that anybody of any age feels like able to begin to tell their story, even to themselves, or to share it with other people, and to just, like, not feel ashamed for the bad things other people did to them, including like all the impacts that come from that, of addiction. And she had so many illnesses. She had so many, 3 different kinds of cancer and heart illness. And it's like the trauma had everything to do with, not the whole deal. I mean, there's environmental factors and all that, but it was, really obvious that it had ravaged her in a lot of ways. And I think people just generally blame themselves, like, I have cancer, like somewhere underneath, like I did something wrong, or my body's letting me down, or, those kinds of things. So just people having a lot of forgiveness for themselves of their own addictions and illnesses, that a lot of this stuff just comes from the environment we're in, and the things that put us onto the wrong track, and the way that, is so much more documented now that she didn't have back then either, of knowing how much the body and mind are not separate from each other, and that our emotions affect our stress responses, and that if you're kicking out all those things all the time, it, leads right to illness. You pick any one you want, diabetes, like all the main illnesses, they lead right there, So yeah, in any way that people can see themselves in a different light, and just take themselves off the hook for things that they didn't bring into their own lives. And then any way they feel able to share their stories, that, anytime anybody does that, then there's a ripple effect that, you tell somebody, and then the next thing you don't know, they're telling somebody, and they're telling, everybody's feeling able to, oh, me too, right? And that, no, it isn't like, oh, do you have a rough story? It's like, oh, what's your rough story? We've all got them. Like, I'm not sitting here by myself. So I would hope that it would have that impact for people. And, if there was anyone who, especially among the young folks, that would see this and go, wow, look at what she did. I think I have the writing bug. That they could see, oh, I could just, I could follow that path. I could find the help I need. I could speak for my people, and, any way that her having done that as best she could, having been removed and come back and sort of as an outsider, insider, but, that anyone would feel that they could do that in a way that would represent these people that are, unknown. Every time I would talk to anybody about Alaska, everybody immediately says, they think of Eskimo, right? There's a lot of stereotyping that the nicest people, are really ignorant about, and I was one of them. I don't fault them at all, but I'm very aware of how not known these cultures are in the interior of Alaska. So just whoever pops off and goes, we're here, let me tell you about who we are, any way it would help that, would be good for the world, to have those bridges in and out from this beautiful culture. Yeah.